thresholds of difference, on a humanistic mission of understanding, and today is widely popular outside of anthropology. Fourth, all disciplinary practitioners ought to recognize the enduring value of the ethnographic corpus that our forebears built over 2 centuries. So this is an encyclopedia of human difference that is a unique and unsurpassed compendium of value to all humanity, I say. Fifth, I wanted to point to the application of anthropology as an applied social science and its long-standing commitment to help society solve its many problems. From the earliest anthropologists, and here on this continent I would point to Lewis Henry Morgan, they recognized that the study of social and cultural difference was indelibly bound to an obligation to help preserve those differences. And then finally, I think we might recognize anthropology's longstanding commitment to the social sciences, to evidence-based reasoning. And from its earliest manifestations, this final enduring feature of the discipline yielded a discourse and a set of concepts that were untethered to any particular cultural setting. So in some manner or another, all of these features lodge anthropology, I think, as an essential component of the classical liberal arts. But when it comes particularly to that ethnographic corpus, that compendium of human difference, that's the domain from which anthropology's conceptualization and its long dalliance with cultural relativism sprang. And this feature of anthropology, I think, speaks to the discipline's foundational recognition of cultural heterodoxy, to the preservation of human difference, and to a social scientific discourse that transcends that heterodoxy. So despite these enduring features and its long-standing capacity to deftly navigate diversity and difference, North American anthropology is today deeply uncomfortable with the many treasures that punctuate its historical trajectory, and with the anthropologists who help articulate them. Reverence for these enduring features was eclipsed in the activist turn that began to overwhelm anthropology at the end of the 20th century. Riding amidst the early crescendo of this turn, in 1995, anthropologist Roy d'Andrade took note of anthropology's emergent commitment to what he called a moral model of the world. In this model, diverse moralities were extricated from the culture concept at the foundation of the discipline's epistemology, thereby allowing Western activist commitments to surge to anthropology's foreground. Today, anthropologists commonly seek to render change in the diverse cultures that they seek to study. In my estimation, at least, it's this activist turn that characterizes the last 3 decades of our discipline's history and is the taproot for anthropology's contemporary problems. But that's really just my opinion, and the panelists assembled here today may disagree, and I've asked them to speak to the problems they see in the discipline's ongoing extrapolation. So with those brief framing comments, I'd like to turn to my panelists now. We've built a set of 3 questions that each panelist is going to address. And then after that, I hope to facilitate a freewheeling discussion with everyone here who's interested in commenting on any aspect of what we have to say. And so the first question that I thought we'd address on this panel is, what's one central concern or issue that, from your perspective, challenges our discipline and clouds its future in American academia? And so with that, I'll turn, I guess, first to you. Rachel, do you want to talk a little bit about what you see as the kind of central concern or problem in our anthropology's future in academia?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, and a brief biographical introduction would be useful as well.
Yes, I'd like to talk about that. And I agree with everything you said. Let me introduce myself because it's actually, I think, critical to put into context my perspective is to understand where I'm coming from, right? I got my PhD in cultural anthropology And I started my first tenure track position in 2001, in fall of 2001, at the College of New Jersey, not too far away from here. And when I started, I was studying immigration, and my first project was to study a neighborhood that was an Italian neighborhood that had shifted to become a Latino neighborhood. So I got some funding, and I got a bunch of students, and we conducted 75 interviews with Italians. And then at the same time, now remember I started in fall of 2001, and you know, if those of us who remember September 11th happened that fall, my first semester. And so by the time I was into this study, you know, the INS had transformed completely and come under the Department of Homeland Security. And the people who were in the neighborhood I was studying were Guatemalans. And many of them had outstanding deportation orders. And they started to enforce those orders exactly at the same time that I was trying to do my studying, you know, doing this very quaint study of neighborhood ethnic transition, which I thought was important. But then, as an anthropologist, I started to become very uncomfortable because I'm running around the neighborhood with a tape recorder, trying to get people to sit down for interviews, life history interviews with me, and the people were basically terrified. And it was at that point that I reflected, and I thought, you know, I'm doing this for the good of knowledge and everything else, but really this project, it makes me a better anthropologist, it accelerates my own career, I'm going to get publications out of it, but what am I actually giving back to this community? Like I'm taking this life history, and in the end, maybe it benefits people, but I just did not see the direct benefit. And so that was kind of a turning point in my career. When I became tenured, I took my first sabbatical, and I went to nursing school, an accelerated 11-month program at Drexel University, and became a nurse because I thought that I could do medical anthropology, and if I had a clinical skill set, no matter what I was studying, I could do something to give back to the community, and that was really my agenda. Then I went back, took a second sabbatical, and in my second sabbatical, obviously 7 years later, I became a nurse practitioner. I'm currently a psychiatric nurse practitioner, and I do see patients and so forth. So my point is that you know, I kind of had this own crisis in terms of what I was doing as an anthropologist, and that made me make this career change. So several years ago, 3 years ago exactly, I switched over to nursing. I left my 19-year position where I was a tenured full professor at the College of New Jersey. I went to Texas and became a nursing professor where I could do actual research and get NIH funding to do the kind of work that would actually help people. And now I'm at the University of Arizona where I work with, I'm interested in cancer and helping people get through the cancer journey using, you know, with mental health tools. So that is my background. So I think it's important to understand that because what I see as the core problem in anthropology is the abandonment of science. That's what I see as the core problem. And what caused that is some of what Andrew was talking about. It was an ideological capture by postmodernists who are anti-science, by Frankfurt School Marxists, by other identitarians who are essentially, as Andrew said, activists. And so while I was trying to do an anthropology that advocated and that gave back to people, what I see as the central problem, we could talk more about this in anthropology, is the anti-science, which makes it impossible to actually advance knowledge to really help people.
Great, thanks. Michael, would you like to respond to that same question next?
Sure. Just briefly, come from a small town in Wisconsin, not exposed to the world at all, but always had interest in the world. So right out of college, I did Peace Corps, went to West Africa, Cameroon for a couple of years, and that turned me on to anthropology and culture. Had not studied it before. Had a business major, actually. Worked as a corporate financial analyst for a year and a half, but was plotting to go back at that same time after Peace Corps to PhD in anthropology. So I did that. and have been an anthropologist at various positions over the years. So interested in certainly the culture concept that you mentioned is crucial, and have shifted to a number of different topics. Have a foot also in sociology and looking at examining social problems and issues domestically. So culture is one of these controversial topics that people kind of don't want to talk about, the whole culture and poverty debate that's been in anthro and sociology over the years, going back from the 60s. Culture, I think, is just one of the crucial elements to understand issues and social problems today. Structure, culture, and individual are kind of those three triads that I see. If you want to have a comprehensive approach that's non-ideological, that looks at all the bases of issues such as crime and poverty and difference in general. So that's the challenge, I think. Anthropology has given up on culture. Ironically, I mean, we should be the main discipline that deals with culture, but we've kind of, especially when we want to talk about social problems and issues, we kind of sideline it and we don't really talk about it so much. Sociology's kind of taken it up somewhat, so there's some interesting interdisciplinary work going on around culture, but it still remains a controversial topic. DEI, of course, is big, and the issue is big, and you can see this, the ignorance or the inability to understand culture, I think, through that topic, both on the left and on the far right, that where the term is allergic. So diversity, for instance, right? It's a reality. We need to understand how to deal with it through understanding culture, but I think those on the extremes of both on the left or right do not do a good job with that. So that's where anthropology, I think, is struggling. We should be at the lead, and we're not.
Great. David, would you both give us a brief introduction to your own experience as an anthropologist and talk a little bit about what you see as the primary challenge or issue that our discipline faces?
Yes, indeed. Hello, everybody. I think what both Rachel and Michael and Andrew have been talking about, I think that all comes out of the fact that anthropology is a very creative but unstable effort to stitch together social science with the humanities. I think it's useful to think of us as the hinge between the social sciences and the humanities. What we are today is essentially the result of exporting Western social science to non-Western contexts and seeing what that looks like. Once you're in a non-Western context, once you're engaging in our methodological specialty of immersion research or participant observation, once you've learned a very different language, once you've spent a lot of time with Buddhists or Mayan Indians, you get a better understanding of how they see the world, and then that also affects what you bring back with you to your own Western context. So that's a really useful thing to do. But what it always entailed was a very critical view of the limitations of Western science. It's great to understand the limitations I mean, everybody should understand the limitations of Western science, but what has happened over the last 50 years, unfortunately, is that because of our doubts, because of our understanding of the limitations of Western science, there has been a consistent drive to reduce anthropology to solidarity with victim groups. Now, it's great to do social immersion with victim groups. It's good to understand how different kinds of, those groups understand the world, but there's a big problem when you declare yourself to be in solidarity with the Mayas or with the people of Gaza, because one thing that anybody learns that doesn't require anthropology to learn this, whenever you take a broad category that you wish to identify with in some way, you wish to study, Gazans are not a homogeneous entity. They have their own internal, they have their own hierarchy. There are political winners and political losers in the population of Gaza. So exactly with whom are you going to be in solidarity? And what I learned over decades of experience in Latin American studies is that both myself and most of my colleagues were succumbing to the temptation of picking out those Mayas, those Guatemalans, those Salvadorans who met our expectations of what Central Americans or Mayas ought to feel. So in effect, we pick out voices who support our own presuppositions, and we ignore or discount people who don't meet those presuppositions. And what also accompanies this this degenerative spiral is what ends up being a systematic denigration of outsider perspectives. Outsider perspectives are the white male gaze or neoliberal capitalist hegemony. And so the duty of anthropologists becomes to identify with those marginalized voices which support whatever you came into the situation with. That's the real limitation of solidarity anthropology, and it just becomes obvious that however much we attempt to bracket, our own position as observers, however much we want to understand the perspectives of other kinds of people, it's simply impossible to abandon the need to retreat to an outside perspective in order to engage in moral judgment over exactly who you're going to listen to, who you're going to believe, who you're going to give less credibility to.
David, I really appreciate that. And before I go on to the next question, I just to kind of frame this, and from what I'm hearing here, I think it kind of fits the kind of framing that I started with, in that in some ways anthropology has turned against its traditional precepts and values, in the sense that it's turned against science, and I would say turned against the concept of culture, right? Or indicted the concept of culture is something that I see in your comments, Michael. And then in yours, I commenced my description of anthropology with this, this commitment to the holistic apprehension of other societies and other cultures. And it feels to me like the solidarity model that you're describing is very much based on uncomplicating that social whole and picking some component rather than trying to apprehend the comprehensive social wholes. That resonates with my experiences researching in the Middle East as well.
Good summation of the point I was trying to make. I think it holds probably wherever anthropologists are studying post-colonial situations, where it's all too easy to focus on structural explanations, and it's all too easy to project what amounts to, I guess, group conceptions of guilt. If you're a white person, you're guilty of the transgressions of white people in previous generations. And what that is essentially, it's a reversal. It's simply a reversal of the old black stain argument. It's a reversal of the old Mark of Cain argument, except now that it applies to whoever you're classifying as the oppressor group. And that oppressor group doesn't have to be a white person. You could turn it into Han Chinese and the record of Han Chinese imperial expansion. But it's a real shortcut, and it does not help us understand what's going on in the 21st century.
Well, I appreciate that. So our second question that we wanted to deal with today was, now that my panelists have each sort of identified their perception of some of the central challenges that our discipline faces, now I've asked you to think about, well, what can we do? How can we as anthropologists, or us as representatives of the discipline of anthropology, what can we do to correct our trajectory in light of the kinds of issues or problems or challenges that you've described? And why don't we go in the same order for that as we try to address what can we do about this? What do you think, Rachel?
So that's a great question. And because I framed the problem as this kind of anti-science, to me the solution is for us to kind of embrace discovery, scholarship, research, that we have to kind of have a renewal in this is our mission, this is what we are doing, and that involves a few things. And first I'll say that, you know, science, as we know, is a method, right? It's a method. So it's a method that involves skepticism of claims. It's a method that involves, you know, testing hypotheses and trying to disprove those hypotheses so that we can expand what we know about the world. And, you know, epistemologically, we're thinking in terms of, yes, the world is knowable, and we can use our senses to know the world. So those are assumptions that, you know, kind of underlie science, but essentially science is a method. And so, you know, because I come at anthropology, and this has always been a debate in anthropology, right, about are we humanities, are we social science? I've been trained as a social science. I'm a very sciencey anthropologist. And I think that is where we can kind of redeem our discipline. So that requires what? It requires objectivity. At least you can never be perfectly objective, but the striving for objectivity. It requires intellectual honesty, which I think we've lost in our discipline. And then it also requires transparency in theoretical perspective. And by that I mean that I have no problem. I mean, here we are at Heterodox Academy, that people have different theoretical perspectives. There's always been Marxists in anthropology, but there's also been other theories that were represented in anthropology, and we had healthy debate about which of these theories saw the world in the most accurate way. But that is no longer the case. We have only orthodoxy. And so there is no transparency about theoretical perspective. It is assumed that everybody thinks the same way. And if you don't think that way, you're a bad person. And that essentially is what we have in anthropology, and it's a tragedy. So I would say, I'm not saying that there should not be theoretical diversity in anthropology. I'm saying that there should be theoretical transparency, and there should be diversity, and some of us want to expand the discipline to move forward, to use this wonderful ethnographic record that we have to actually make the world a better place by expanding knowledge. And we can only do that if we actually are using the same, you know, kind of toolkit. And that's where, again, I'm advocating for science.
Michael, your thoughts?
Sure, yes. I mean, similar. I did graduate school in the 1990s at Wisconsin, and I was influenced. That was the postmodern movement, was really starting in the 80s and really strong in the 90s. So I was influenced by postmodernism, the move in anthropology. I thought it opened up more room for different kind of viewpoints, religious viewpoints, and other kind of viewpoints that just didn't follow the Western science model. But since then, given all that's happened since then, I have really come back to an appreciation of science and what it does. Given the whole I think misunderstanding or the whole distrust in science, it gives us a common knowledge, a common method, I think. Postmodernism has not, I think it's kind of become a dead end, although there are still insights we can use from it. I don't want to totally discount it. I do think that the scientific method is probably our greatest hope. So my example of where anthropology, I like to refer to the work of Joseph Henrich at Harvard with his culture lab. If you're familiar with the weirdest people in the world, he's the one who talks about weird, weird, educated, industrialized, rich. Basically, this is the question, this long-standing, huge question of the Great Divergence. Why over history? One of these big questions that academics love to study and have written about. Why have we had, in the last several hundred years, this division between an industrialized, now very wealthy West, which is very unusual, I think, in our society. We don't understand how unusual it is to live in a society like this. We've had this division between a westernized, wealthy West and still a world which is traditional, subsistence-oriented, and the gaps became huge. Henrik's Culture Lab, and why that happened has been a huge topic of debate. David Landis, Jared Diamond, all these big names have written about that, and genes and germs and steel and whatever. I think the best answer that we've seen is Joseph Henrik's work. I won't go into an explanation of it, but he combines, he's an anthropologist, but he's biologist, so he does cultural evolution, biological approaches, he adds psychology, he adds economics. It's very interdisciplinary and it's scientific. They've done more social psych experimental on how people think. So it gets into the difference is how people think and how that developed historically. So he combines that with historical work about specific changes. What he came up with was key changes in the West under the church and connected to kinship when they disallowed first cousin marriage. That would seem to be, through all his experiments and research and everything, seemed one of the key roles, not the only one. Brings in Weber, of course, but the main thing, he traces it back earlier to this change in marriage practice and kinship. So he gets the basic anthropology stuff. Very interdisciplinary, very good, I think, pretty decisive answer to that big question, but still under for debate somewhat. So anyway, that's my example.
Yeah, I actually, though, I want to push you a little further. So in your initial comments, you, at least in part, identified anthropology's strange abandonment of culture and cultural difference. What can a person like me who teaches Introduction to Anthropology every semester, ushers students into oftentimes their first vista point on anthropology, what can a teaching anthropologist like myself do to help re-energize the value that we see in estimations of culture and cultural difference, which seems to be where, I mean, we've shirked this concept that's at the root of our discipline. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Henrik is a good example. Unfortunately, among anthropologists, he's kind of ignored, I think, which is the ironic thing. So within anthropology, that kind of model, for example, I think can be brought up as an excellent model. When a lot of other anthropologists seem to be ignoring it, he's gotten popular outside of anthropology, but they kind of misplace him. So I think what we need to do is call upon the work that anthropologists are doing that maybe doesn't get the attention among anthropologists that it should, or even in the wider public that it should. So I think there's good work that we can, and interesting work too, that we can call upon and highlight.
Great. David, with the problem that you identified that had to do with the kind of politics of solidarity, at least in part, how do you think anthropology can course correct? What are some of the ways that we might fix the problem that you've perceived?
Well, once you're reducing anthropology to solidarity with the oppressed, and you're identifying yourself as a member of the oppressed group, and you have to do atonement for who you are, that prioritizes the so-called marginalized voice, which you have picked out probably to support your own presuppositions. And how I would push back against that is by pointing out the value of the profound insight that is to be gained by deliberately picking out a group which is very different from you across some significant social boundary. It could be gender, it could be race, it could be cultural, it could be religious, it could be national. You pick out a group that is very different from you, and then you go immerse yourself in it. You engage in long-term immersion-style research sometimes known as participant observation. And then you bring back that insight into your own cultural context. Not only have you learned a lot about another group, you also have more critical perspective on your own group. A long gone mid-20th century anthropologist named Clyde Kluckhohn was one of the people who conceptualized the utility of this. He called anthropology a mirror for man. We would now say mirror for humanity. You look into the anthropological mirror and you find out more about yourself. Now, something really interesting happened toward the end of the 20th century. A renowned postcolonial theorist named Edward Said wrote a book called Orientalism, and he used the concept of othering very effectively to show how certain kinds of Western scholarship had othered the Mideast in order to reinforce how Westerners think about the Mideast as profoundly different than the West. And so Edward Said did a pretty good job of documenting how othering can be profoundly pejorative or subordinating. The problem, and this became a wildly popular, this is now a foundational work of postcolonial theory and critical theory. And the problem with how his work has been deployed by subsequent generations of postcolonial theorists is that they're ignoring the fact that othering is an everyday, basic everyday operation of human consciousness. I can only be a man if there's an other category called women. I can only be white if there are black people. I can only be an American if there are such things as French or Mexicans. So that's just neutral cognitive othering. And then another interesting thing about othering is that it can be profoundly admiring. You can really idealize the other. And there's a long history of Westerners idealizing indigenous people, Chinese, Buddhists, you name it. There's a long history of that. So what I'm suggesting is that I guess what I would call ethnographic othering, picking out somebody who's really different from you and going and immersing yourself in it and being uncomfortable, and then coming back to your own society, that's actually crucial to doing interesting new work in anthropology. Just generally speaking, I think anthropology in a context very, very different from what the anthropologist grew up in tends to be more fruitful than anthropology with your own, ethnography with your own kind, although we can certainly find great examples of ethnography with your own so-called homeboy or homegirl research. You know, it can be done well.
I'll just kind of continue that and answer some of the things that I've been doing on this front. One, with Melissa Checker in the back of the room, we put together a session at the SFA last year that was really focused on reconnecting with some of the classic traditional anthropologists from previous generations, trying to sort of appreciate their work rather than just vilify it or condone it. And in my classes, similarly, I have my students read a lot of older ethnography as well to try to reconnect our discipline, our contemporary discipline with its traditions. And then when it comes to the othering thing, I've found a lot of resonance in my classes, at least, David, with this idea that outsiders can sometimes see more about a culture or a society than insiders can. And of course, my students are very comfortable with that when they're thinking about an outsider looking at America, but they become, of course, less comfortable with that when they're talking about, you know, an American going somewhere else. But being able to see things that cultural insiders can't see, I do seem to find some leverage with that idea. Cool. Our last question, I'm going to put my reading glasses back on here. So I think we've all been kind of pointing at some of the internal problems that anthropology has and how we might fix them. I asked you guys to speak to both of those issues. But now I kind of wanted to turn, what would a rehabilitated version of anthropology have to contribute to the future of American academia? And I'm thinking maybe even a little more precisely, what specific contribution might anthropology offer to the heterodox academic future that, well, many of us here certainly envision? So we'll go in the same order. What do you think anthropology might be able to contribute to a more heterodox academia?
Going back to the roots of cultural anthropology is the notion of culture, which we keep is a recurring theme here. But it's so critically important, and our method of participant observation, it's been copied by other social science disciplines, but they kind of do a quick and dirty version of it. I mean, we anthropologists are the ones who go out into the field and actually learn, another way of life. That is huge. I mean, that method of participant observation is enormous. Ethnography, ethnographic interviewing, and then, and let me give you an example. So, I told you before that so now I'm trying to develop interventions that could be used with people undergoing cancer treatment and the side effects that they go through. So one of the things that, one of the studies that I'm developing is, it's a study of men with prostate cancer. But one of my studies specifically looks at Hispanic men with prostate cancer. Why? Because I'm an anthropologist and I've worked with Latino, especially Mexican populations, and I understand that gender constructs in Mexican culture are quite different. Family constructs are different. The way the way cancer is looked at in Mexico is totally different than the way cancer is looked at in the United States. So there are all these cultural differences that warrant a culturally tailored intervention for specifically Hispanic men with prostate cancer. And so that is an example of using anthropological tools, using anthropological insights and methods to yield important data that can contribute to a very important sector of society. The other thing I want to kind of point out is this respect for other ways of knowing is also something that is inherently, like whenever I'm asked to give a diversity statement or whatever, when I've been on the job market and now they can't do it, but they'd say give us a diversity statement, and I'm like, I'm an anthropologist, I'll just tell you about anthropology. It's like it's like that's what we do. Right? And so that in itself, we cannot forget that as anthropologists. We've been doing this for a very long time. The mistake that some of my colleagues have made, and this is not just a recent thing, is that rather than just respect other ways of knowing, they kind of worship other ways of knowing, which we used to call, kind of going native on one hand, which Carlos Castaneda did a long time ago. He's not an authentic anthropologist. And then the other is the problem of the, quote, noble savage, where we study people who are different, and then we make them, just because they're different and just because we see them in ways that they wouldn't have status in our own society, that we kind of victimize them, but then we put them on a pedestal and make them better. And all that kind of stuff is stuff we need to avoid, but those debates have been in anthropology forever, and that's where it belongs. It belongs something to be debated. But the point is that diversity and appreciating that people are different and think differently, and using that in our, again, my answer to question 2, research, so that we can make things better for people, to me is a huge contribution that we can make to a heterodox anthropology future.
Great. Michael?
Yeah, I don't know, Rachel, if you're only studying Hispanic men, it sounds like your grants are going to get canceled, right? I mean, that's, the whole issue of diversity. I mean, we're just, we're really struggling with that. Now we've got the political challenges of, it's gone boomerang to the other side, and we're caught in the middle. That's where we are. But
we shall have Latinx men.
Kind of along the same lines, other ways of knowing you mentioned. I mean, I've seen a lot in the last month or two about what's called variously the epistemic crisis, or the crisis of knowledge we're facing in our society that's gotten really intense now. Everyone has a different set of facts, right? I mean, this gets at the crisis of science. And people have compared it to a huge shift in how we communicate and how we understand knowledge, right? We had the shift from orality to print, several hundred years ago with Gutenberg. The shift to the television age, and now with the internet and social media, and I'm old enough now to have seen these changes. I remember when it was Walter Cronkite and ABC News. Everyone watched the news at night. My parents, had the TV on. Now it's like a different world nowadays. Everyone is looking at different sources of information, and we have different facts. People see the world entirely differently. And that, I think we're just coming to the realization of how troubling and how problematic that's going to be for the future of our society. Heterodox is caught kind of right in the middle of that, right? We see that we don't see that just upon, uneducated people on the right. We see it on the left also. We see it even among academics now, where they've canceled people because they haven't had the right ideas or the right set of facts. So my point is that anthropologists, I think, are well placed to understand this. Anthropology is the best place, I'll just read, best place discipline to get at this and maybe deal with it. It combines a philosophical understanding of epistemology across different groups and different ways of thinking with on-the-ground analysis of technological and cultural change. So we've got the philosophical thing, and we've got the on the ground. We understand. We know what's happening with people. We can see what's happening with different groups of diverse people around the world and how they're learning and how they're socializing their kids and how technology is influencing them in their work world and all of that stuff. It combines the biology of thought and emotion and actions, great, biological stuff, biological anthropologists doing good work there, combined the biology of thought and emotion and action with the groupishness of our behavior and the social and cultural mechanisms that play a role. The biocultural side, there's good work in anthropology. Another thing to highlight is biocultural approaches. Some friends of mine work in that. It brings in how institutions and structures play a role in this, and individuals like charismatic demagogues, and with the overlap of religion and cult, where you compare political groups or different groups to kind of cult-like behavior. So all of these anthropological topics, we're really well placed to understand all of this. So anthropology should be the go-to discipline for understanding all this going on. So I'll just cut it there.
David, your thoughts on what anthropology might have to offer a more heterodox academic future?
I'll answer that question in terms of context you've mentioned. Teaching anthropology to undergraduates. I teach at a Middlebury college, which is a liberal arts college about five hours north of here. When I first arrived at Middlebury around 2000, 80% of the students in my introductory classroom would be white, middle and upper middle class students, typically most of them from prep schools, and well-funded from wealthy suburbs. That was 80% of the room. And so what we did in introductory anthropology is try to immerse those students in really, really different cultural contexts. We basically did an ethnography a week with a group that was really, really different from American culture. We did Gil Hurt's The Sambia, which features homosexual initiation rites. We did Marjorie Wolf's House of Lim, which involves adoptive brothers marrying adoptive sisters. We did that kind of thing to sort of get them out of the suburbs as quickly as possible. And so that was their experience with the other. And then we brought them back to our own context with social science analytical frameworks. The last time I taught introductory anthropology, ending just a month or two ago, very, very few people in the room were white, upper middle class Americans. It was a classroom composed mainly international students from Africa, from China. There were a bunch of first or 1.5 or second gen immigration kids there. And it suddenly occurred to me that most of those students had to cross a significant cultural boundary to come live in a rather small white town in central Vermont. Most of them are from demographically diverse suburban areas, if not from Africa or China. So it suddenly occurred to me, for these students, they are actually doing the equivalent of anthropological field work. They're doing immersion research in a very different context than the one from which they're come. And I, doing the lectures, I'm their other. And so I've started to rethink anthropology for this kind of student in these terms, and I think it's extremely useful for them, because whether or not they ever go to whether or not they end up in an anthropology course, coming to the United States, just coming from Houston to Vermont, they're crossing all these boundaries, and they're being othered, and they are othering in different ways. And so what the conceptual frameworks we can give them do, we're helping them to analyze all the emotions that they're having, the feelings of rejection they have, the feelings of the not just rejection, but also the admiration, the way that they can be romanticized. Oh, you're from Africa, or oh, you're from Texas. Giving a vocabulary to help them negotiate all that. And there's nothing about immersion research with the other that requires you to be white or male. The fact that the first people to do that were heavily white and male, that's basically a historical accident. It's just a very simple, I think, extremely fruitful way of looking at how people cross boundaries and become socialized into new groups.
I really appreciate that. Well, I guess my battery's dead.
Here.
Well, that actually wraps up the questions that we had prepared. I guess to answer my own question, I really think that there's a lot of thematic connections here. In my mind, certainly everything you were talking about, Michael, and you as well, this kind of long-standing appreciation and study of human difference and diversity, past and present, is and remains the core subject of our discipline. Just to return to a point I made earlier, though, I think what maybe makes anthropology unique is that these aren't just ideas and theories, but we're also shepherding this empirical resource, this encyclopedia that our forebears assembled. We're shepherding this into the future. And so we actually, as a discipline, have not just outdated theories, but we have ethnographies that people were writing 100 years ago about peoples who are changed or maybe gone altogether now. But we have this encyclopedia of diversity that we will continue to shepherd into the future. And I just point to that. So, hey, the remainder of our time here is for discussion, comments, questions, reflections with you guys. Just as a quick reminder, the sort of 3 points that we touched on were: what are the problems that we perceive with anthropology as it stands today? What might we do to fix those problems? And what might anthropology have to offer a more heterodox academia? And now open to the audience. Any questions, comments, reflections of any sort? Please.
I'm wondering, in your last observation of how different the environment of Middlebury and perhaps its county portion, if you will, and surroundings is compared to the experience of the students coming there. My observation, working mostly as I have on supporting resource workers in the Intermountain West, has been that you know, America is rich itself for us to immerse ourselves in other cultures. And here I'm talking about work culture, but I feel like work is such a vital part of the American experience that I'm wondering if there are possibilities within anthropology to, and perhaps already being done, but in connecting Americans across these differences, and not simply people that visit, oh, you know, Margaret Goodall went and, you know, lived with the chimpanzee, or some other person lived with a tribe somewhere. I'm wondering about the opportunities here.
Oh, I'd say there are enormous opportunities here. One of the limitations of Middlebury College is that we tended to recruit from a more or less homogeneous base in the Northeast and North. And specifically, I think there's an Anthropology of Work section. Is that a journal or is it a section? And what I've been most impressed by is ethnography of meatpacking plants and other factories. The person doing the observation is usually someone like myself with pretty smooth hands. You know, we had pampered upbringings, but it's a, you know, especially meatpacking plants. You know, they're very tough regime. The work has been speeded up in ways that consciously, this is corporate policy, in effect exclude citizens. Citizens have enough knowledge of their rights, they're not going to put up with it, they have more options. So the workforce is here now, heavily first-gen immigrants, and you know, the labor movement has been trying to organize these plants since the 1980s with very little success. But that would be a great example of how our American house has many mansions. There's just so many different parts of this society. There's no need to take out a passport to cross an international boundary to do great anthropology in the United States.
Just quickly on that too. We live, I still have my affiliation at Boston U, but we moved to the Intermountain West about 4 years ago. Southern Idaho is where we're living now. My first experience in the West. So I've been writing things up about cultural differences. The move right during COVID from Massachusetts to Idaho. I'm from the Midwest originally, but these cultural differences have been fascinating. Individualism. A long time ago, I wrote something for the Anthropology newsletter about the anthropology of middle-class families. I better check back with that again about how to do that. It's quite a while now. But anyway, yeah, excellent topic. And there are clear differences, clear different worlds. And we have an Indian reservation right outside of Pocatello. That clash of you know, traditional Westerners, Latinos, and Native Americans. They're not clashing. A lot of times, most of the time, they get along. But there are issues, there are tensions. So yeah, interesting.
Actually, I'd like to respond to that as well, because I think that's a really interesting point that you make. And you're right, the possibilities for anthropological and ethnographic research here in the US are extraordinary. For example, I work in Tacoma, Washington. It's a very blue, very progressive area, and I've been sending my students to do this for a month in the summer, to go live by themselves in a rural community on the eastern side of the mountains, and to write open-mindedly and compellingly about the people that they encounter there, in trying to sort of using the ethnographic toolkit to try to destabilize some of the kinds of cultural divisions that are very prominent in the US today. But that said, I think there's also a danger here, right? Because when we're researching, doing ethnographic and anthropological research in the United States, we also have rights, we have votes, we have a say in how this polity is organized and what laws govern it. And I think there's something different about the anthropological experience, in my case, for example, of going to the Arabian Peninsula, a place where I have no say at all in how things ought to be done or how they ought to be configured. And there's something, I think, valuable and rich about that departure, right, from one's home as well. That I think is a fairly integral feature of anthropology. But I love that question. Yeah, please.
Yeah, thanks for the different remarks. I have a quick question, a little bit different from where you've been. How would you apply your anthropological insights to HXA and sort of as a culture, as a group?
Who? Maybe for the recording, I should repeat the question. I don't know if you can hear it. How would you apply your anthropological insights to HXA? Is that what you're saying? Okay, just for the
We're
recording.
supposed to analyze the
Yeah.
Who wants to
Have we been taking notes and doing field work? Have we been studying all of you, or I don't know, but
thoughts? Well, it seems to me that I've been to 2 of these conferences now, and in terms of ethnicity, it seems like it's less ethnically diverse than it was the last time I was here. I've also been tuned in to the fact that I had an experience on my campus that galvanized me. I was attempted cancellation as an anthropologist and a professor on my campus. And in the last session that I was in, it was pretty apparent that a lot of people have had that experience. And so, I mean, I guess the anthropologist in me is really curious about the kinds of experiences that lead people to this perspective and this worldview. I've been thinking a lot about that, but I'm definitely grabbing at straws trying to respond to your question. Other thoughts?
I would think in terms of in-group, out-group processes. And I believe, like I've come to several Heterodox Academy meetings. I've been a member for a long time. And I always feel comfortable here because like I have something in common with everyone here. Like I just have to find that conversation with people, and it's a bonding thing. And so that's like a huge, so why? Because by definition, right, somebody who's interested in heterodox thinking knows that there is an orthodoxy. So just that is like huge, right? And so that gives us common ground. So no matter which discipline we come from, there's some reason that people are here, and that's a kind of a bonding thing. So I would say that's very I would think that's an anthropological insight to kind of think about how people bond to each other through common identity, and that's the way I kind of see HXA.
Just briefly, I mean, I haven't been to the American Anthropological Association conference, the big one of anthropologists, for a while. I'm going to go in November in New Orleans, and I'll be manning an HXA table there, actually, which will be an interesting experience to try to pitch it. But when I go to those AAA meetings, my anthropological antenna goes up. Like, this is a really odd group of people. I don't want to be, they have agendas, they kind of have rituals, and they're alienated. I think, even though they expect, my sense is that even though they're supposed to be studying society, they're a very kind of odd group and alienated from the rest of American society, partly because of their political orientations and ideological biases and things like that. Although it's a diverse group, so I don't want to be too negative on them. My anthropological antenna hasn't gone up here as much. I haven't sensed that alienation, and maybe just because I feel like Rachel, a part of the group here too, and maybe I'm maybe it's my own bias that I haven't sensed that, but I just don't see the weirdness, and I don't mean negative here, that I have at AAA, if I can put it in that language.
Please.
Just to be clear, I'm not an anthropologist. I'm in the science and technology studies, so my colleagues are anthropologists, and I read a lot of anthropology. I do ethnographic work and historical work. One of the things that I'm hearing in you guys articulating these problems is that there's this fundamental problem or tension that comes about from anthropology being committed to the study of how things are rooted in culture, and then you have the question of how you deal with the fact that you as an anthropologist therefore are also rooted in a culture, and how do you handle that reflexively? My reading of the the problems that you're talking about with oppressor and oppressed distinctions, which I definitely see in my own area of work also, is that there is a fundamental failure to calculate in where you stand with your own power in those things. And that people, there's like this simultaneously like wanting to give up your power, but you gain power by giving up power, right? And so you get in these weird tensions where like by claiming that I am the oppressed, then I therefore have more authority to speak than you do, and then you get a lot of that weird cancel culture stuff coming out of that. My feeling is that the solution to a lot of the problems of anthropology that you bring up is more anthropology. So within our field and science and technology studies, so it's a lot of like sociology, anthropology of science and technology, is when people started bringing that social science stuff into science, this was when I was a PhD student in the 90s, there was so much pushback from scientists who were like, no, if you're saying that we're socially constructed, you're saying there's no truth, you're saying there's no objective reality, you're going to destroy science, it's going to be terrible, and a lot of people lost their jobs and stuff like that in that period. But what's happened in the time since then is that like now most of my colleagues collaborate with scientists and technologists, because they say, we need somebody to tell us what are the ethical issues. We need somebody to tell us how are we structured socially and how could we be doing things better. And so you get to a point where being able to recognize the ways in which these things are constructed actually helps you to do the thing better. So like my colleagues would not say that science is a method. They would not say that science is simply achieving truth. They have these really complex and nuanced ideas about it. And they're some of the biggest cheerleaders for science that there is, right? And supportive of it, and like in these recent attacks from the federal government, really defending science. And it's being able to grapple with the complexity and nuance of that, that really brings that out. So be curious to hear what you guys think about that.
I like everything you said. I
Great.
think there's this spiral of reflexivity,
Yes.
which you've seen some of your colleagues get into, and I think it helps to recognize that everyone in science, everyone in academia has a moral agenda, whether or not you recognize it, and just knowing that everybody has a moral agenda, I think, is a check and balance on assuming unwarranted moral authority, because that's the problem here. I have plenty of experience with debates over white guilt. That's very strong in Native American studies and in Latin American studies. And I think it also helps to recognize that the only way to be a scientist, academic, or social scientist, it just requires power differentials. We wouldn't be lucky enough to be in this room if we hadn't succeeded in stepping into some kind of power differential and then turning it to a constructive purpose, a humane purpose, not a self-aggrandizing tromp on opponents purpose. So the mere existence of power differentials doesn't really say anything. Those are pervasive in social life. Everyone who everyone with any ability to negotiate social relationships and get where you want to go. How did you do it? Well, there were power differentials that you took advantage of, but you can do that in an ethical manner, or you can be very unethical. But the mere existence of power differentials doesn't mean anything really, and the mere existence of having a moral agenda, everybody has it.
I want to say something. It's very controversial. I'm going to say something I'm going to shake everything up. So one of the problems with this work in anthropology that's been totally driven by identity politics is that it's rubbed off, you know, like you're talking about technology, but and science and technology, but it's rubbed off on people on the science. So like, you know, I do clinical medical research, and it's like the clinical medical research has become, like what they do is they take the ideas from sociology and anthropology and they apply them to, and they think that they're making their work better. But the problem is there's so much junk science coming out of anthropology and sociology that and those folks, like, they know medical science, you know, and so they like apply it, and it causes all kinds of problems. And then so this brings us to this whole thing with the NIH, and the stop in funding of the NIH and what's happening there. Because like I'm currently applying for NIH funding, right? So like this, I have skin in this game, right? But what's happened is that it's become so political, like the actual RFAs, the calls for proposals, the things that they've been funding over the last, 5 to 10 years have become increasingly about identity politics, so that they'll fund some obscure study about like 0.1% of the population, and then they won't fund something that would actually benefit like more of the population. And we have to keep in mind that these are public funds. Like the NIH is funded, it's a US government agency that's funded with US taxpayer money. And so I'm like observing like my fellow scientists freaking out because they're cutting this, they're cutting that, they're canceling review sections. But the reality is that the RFAs themselves, like the proposals themselves, were basically telling people to find discrimination. Like literally, like they would say, like they would privilege funding. And so it's like so they're telling you the answer to the problem. So rather than you go and study something, and maybe discrimination is an issue, maybe that is the answer to why there's this differential. But the way that these things were written, the people who wrote the proposals, who hypothesized that it was all about discrimination and then eventually found that it was discrimination because they knew that it's confirmation bias from the very beginning, they knew that was gonna happen. That's what was funded, and that it's been that way for like the last 5 to 10 years. And so all of a sudden, everyone was like, got into the game. Grantsmanship means writing something that is identity politics and it'll get funded. And then all of a sudden they change the rules and people are freaking out and saying that it's anti-science. And I'm sorry, it is not anti-science. It's corrective of an ideological bent. The science should be science. You don't come out like it's because of discrimination that there are these things. No, there are disparities. Why are there disparities? That's the question that we need to answer. We don't go into it assuming that it's discrimination that caused the disparities. So that's my 2 cents on that. That kind of relates to what you said. Yes?
Yeah, go ahead. I just see the same thing in sociology. I mean, the racial discrimination is really where you see, I think, most of the junk science, because people want to prove structural discrimination as opposed to culture and other things. So it's really been a huge problem.
Right.
No, excellent. So I'm a behavioral science professor. I do organizational psychology and some cross-cultural psychology as well. And I had an experience a couple of years ago at a conference. I developed a way of measuring some traits like tolerance for ambiguity that have cross-cultural implications. And we collected data from maybe 20, 30 different countries, and I was presenting my results, and I had a few sample questions from the scales, and when we got to the Q&A, there was a woman in the back from India. She stood up, was very angry because she insisted that my questions were culturally biased, because no woman in India would answer yes or strongly agree to several of those questions. And so I'm on the spot, and I have to, figure out how to respond. I said, well, I do agree that I have bias, but it's not the bias you accuse me of. I have a bias in favor of drawing my conclusions based on evidence and data. I went to India, sampled hundreds of Indian women, and they actually did answer yes and strongly agree to my items at a rate that was comparable to women from other countries. And she says, I don't care, you're a white male, you're biased, there's no way your questions could be culturally relevant. And I walked away from that thinking to myself, we do have our biases in science, and one of the ways I see that reflected as a behavioral science discipline is that we have an awful lot of physics envy and chemistry envy because they can do science in a vacuum or in a test tube and measure the speed of light, and it's like, there's a lot of precision in that. And they tend to call that the hard sciences, and what we do in the social and behavioral sciences they call soft science. But there's really not hard and soft science. There's hard science and there's easy science. Easy science is what you do in the STEM disciplines. Because it's like you weigh it, you measure it. It's pretty straightforward. But you know, when we do the behavioral sciences, this whole idea of being aware of what our own ideologies are and our own moral positions doesn't invalidate the research, but it's something we need to be more informed about ourselves as well as our colleagues. Anyway, I thought I could throw that out for comment.
I totally agree. I mean, you present an interesting problem because I'm in behavioral sciences that we're trying to measure things. So let's go back to what's the benefit of anthropology? Well, I'll sell a benefit of anthropology. The benefit of anthropology is that you can do mixed methods as an anthropologist, right? So those scales that you're talking about, that's quantitative measure. And so we want to know, like, is it measuring what we think it's measuring? And that's what that woman was accusing you of. And it's like she had her own biases, obviously. But, you know, you're right, like those measures, even among everyone's the same culture, people misread them, they have their own interpretations of them. But anthropology can bring to the table that you do your quantitative measures, you measure depression, you measure anxiety, you measure those things using these standardized measures. But then you interview the people. Right? So now you're getting two types of data. You have quantitative and qualitative data. And then the mixed methods is informing one with the other, combining them and integrating them. Okay? So I would argue that like people who have, you know, animal labs, do animal-based models and have labs and all that stuff, yeah, but there's things that we can do on the behavioral science side to make it more rigorous, to really get to what's happening in the world. And I would say that we are, as anthropologists, we're in an excellent position to contribute to scientific studies by bringing the qualitative piece in so that people doing quantitative stuff can use a mixed methods approach.
I think your comment also speaks to the fraught position that I experience as an anthropologist today, though. I mean, when I look at our forebears in anthropology, Malinowski, you know, came back from the Trobriand Islands in whatever, 1916, 18, with a text that the Trobrianders themselves would never see or read or comment on, right? So he was the authoritative author of, well, what is Trobriand culture like? And nowadays, of course, in our media environment, that's much different, right? I mean, my students in class, if I'm talking to them about what things are like for the contemporary Bedouin nomads in Saudi Arabia, they can, you know, go find somebody a Bedouin who's talking about that. And so I think that does, you know, really change a lot for the presentation of culture for anthropologists. But at the same time, I mean, I at least in part try to stick to that long-standing anthropological truism, at least for ethnographic work, that sometimes outsiders can see and perceive things that insiders can't. Outsiders' perspectives should be valuable in that sense. We have time for more.
I've never had the opportunity to talk to four anthropologists at once, so I'm just taking advantage of this. But this also bears on one of the basic themes you've talked about, and also relates to what you said. I was deeply involved with American Indians 50 years ago through a significant other. And one of the things
Can you hear him in the back, by the way?
Yeah. One of the things that I observed with American Indians in various incidents was that you have a kind of, because this is my experience in immersion in a different culture, but one of the aspects that I noticed very strikingly was how aware they were of the general world. This is not in a reservation or anything. So that there was a notion that there's a generalized intelligence there that transcends all these different cultures, all the otherness and so forth. And it creates a tension with your whole notion of culture that you've been pushing, which is not, I'm not denying that, but there's a tension there. And it's evinced by different people to different degrees, but you have this kind of thing that's transcending all these cultural differences.
Could I respond to that? That's an acute observation you made. Anthropologists have had loads of trouble with the term culture. It's really culture that gave us our place in the social science division of labor. We were in charge of studying the non-Western part of the world, and we decided to call them cultures or societies. But in actual fact, we were operating on the basis of a very specific notion of culture that was developed by German thinkers in the mid-19th century. And that's the idea that the culture is a distinct way of life that might change, but only slowly. And the problem with this definition of culture, which, you know, this is the horse we rode for most of the 20th century, the problem is that cultures are not as, the boundaries are much more porous than that definition implies. And there's all kinds of exchanges that occur across cultures and across on a you know, regular basis. And so the in my introductory teaching, I definitely give them that culture, that definition, and then I tell them, you know, it's just not good enough not only to deal with our own globalized world, it also, you know, had big problems at any other period of human existence. And so what I tell them is that at bottom, culture is our ability to imitate each other, to copy each other. That puts it in opposition to biology. The fact that I can cry is a biological fact. The fact that I might tear up when I hear the Guatemalan national anthem, that's a very weird, culturally induced result of my personal history, that I find that an emotional experience. So once you adopt this broader level of culture as our ability to imitate each other, that then enables you to decide at what analytical level are you going to look at, say, Guatemalans and Americans. Are you going to look at them at the level of exchange? You're going to look at them at the level of authority or power? Are you going to compare Americans and Guatemalans on level or at the level of kinship patterns, of religion? You could, once you've got that overarching umbrella concept of culture, then you can pick out your analytical level. You can get much more precise about what the differences are and where the differences actually break down. And where the idea that there's a Guatemalan culture, in effect, ends up misleading us because it minimizes how much Guatemalans and Americans have in common. Does that help at all?
A bit. Because you yourself showed me, I don't know, that with your Rigobert Manchu book, that you can have people that are FOS that are not white males.
What's FOS mean?
Full of shit.
Okay. Thank you. I've learned something new this morning.
Hey, I guess we're out of time. That's a great concluding sentiment. Thank you so much for attending our session, and I hope we have a great conclusion of the conference.
And we can hang around for questions or whatever, too.